Was Space Jam a good film? Well, it depends on how you define good. For those who have never heard the premise spoken out loud, Space Jam was a 1996 star-studded crossover that featured world-famous basketball player and pinnacle of 90s society Michael Jordan teaming up with the Looney Tunes to play a game of basketball against some cartoon aliens. The film was made to capitalize on a series of shoe commercials that aired during Super Bowls in the early 90s, making it the first of what I could barely believe are multiple films based on Michael Jordan's shoes. Now, if you think this doesn't sound like the foundation of a film capable of exemplifying both the conceptual highs of animation and the boundless emotion of a quality sports movie, well, you're absolutely right, my guy. Out of all the decades-old cult classics that top everyone's list of childhood faves, few have taken the hits over time that Space Jam has. Arguably seen as a staple of family film by the early 2000s, when the digital age saw this movie revisited by YouTube reviewers, nostalgic adults, and newer fans exploring the back catalogs of classic characters, their reactions were generally not great. The film suffered from a weak premise and world building, shallow characterizations of the cartoon stars, and a lot of weak jokes. In fact, the most successful thing about the film was arguably Lola Bunny, who would go on to star in a number of diverse, well-advertised, and tediously crafted Rule 34 picks. Of course, some could argue that none of that actually matters, because the film was a smash hit financially. It made Warner Bros. $250 million against an $80 million budget, reinvigorated interest in the less-than-popular Looney Tunes franchise, and won several awards along the way, becoming the 10th highest-grossing film of 1996. Generally, those kinds of provable benchmarks are what studios look for when judging whether a movie is good, or more importantly, whether it's worth moving ahead with a sequel. Space Jam 2: A New Legacy will premiere in July of 2021, this time starring LeBron James alongside those same Looney Tunes we know and love. Except, instead of being based on any kind of commercial or promotional tie-in, Space Jam 2 is based on the idea that the first movie needed a sequel eventually. But why the wait? How did it take 25 years to get from Space Jam 1 to Space Jam 2? Well, the answer to such a simple question actually involves a lot of complicated parts, including lying executives, generational animation politics, and the ever-present battle of the people who care versus the people who profit. Today, we're looking at Warner Bros.' multiple canceled attempts at a second Space Jam, as well as the oft-forgotten Looney Tunes back in action, to see what made the original engine of Astro inadequacy so hard to follow up. These are the scrapped Space Jam sequels, and all the ways they were roughed up. One would think that the most logical way to approach a Space Jam sequel would be the way you approach any family film sequel, by slapping a 2 on the end of it and getting to work. For Warner Bros., this was the original plan. After Space Jam's initial success, WB was interested in the idea of a follow-up, but according to artist Bob Camp, had one requirement that had to be met before it could enter production. Michael Jordan had to come back. While Bugs Bunny was certainly a recognizable character, MJ was a cultural monolith, and it was his presence that ultimately drew fans back to the Looney Tunes, not vice versa. Warner needed the same sense of security about their big hits, big sequel before getting things started. And while many were worried about the availability of Jordan, who had since unretired from basketball for real, Camp stated an unnamed producer claimed he was able to wrangle Air Jordan back one more time. Space Jam 2 began work in 1997, with director Joe Pica returning, and Animaniacs veteran Spike Brandt, who would later help helm the Looney Tunes show, coming on to co-direct. Some of the only known pieces of work done on the film come from Camp himself, who designed the villain Berserko and his henchmen Oh Yes and Oh No. For his part, Camp didn't really know what he was doing. While visually, the villain was based on Mel Brooks, with plans to get the comedic veteran to voice the character, in a story context, Camp wasn't told anything, including what Berserko would do in the plot, or even why he hated the Looney Tunes. The film script was being written behind closed doors, and even those working on Space Jam 2 only knew about what came with their specific role, with all other information handed out on a need-to-know basis. Camp would elaborate on his time on the film, stating,
"They didn't really talk to me about it. They just said draw him. The eye was my idea. I thought it would be cool for him to have an eyeball and a stalk growing out of his head, since he was an alien.
Unfortunately, things wouldn't get much farther than that. Before the studio could get Brooks to sign on, it was revealed that the producer who confirmed the involvement of Michael Jordan had just lied about it. Jordan hadn't signed on to anything, had no intention of doing another movie, and after learning this, Warner Bros. Shut everything down faster than you could say alley-oop. It's likely the script was never completed, with Camp himself noting he was only present for a few weeks before everything was shuttered. While this would be the end of the line for several key figures on the first film, such as director Joe Pytka, Warner Bros. Was far from finished with the Looney Tunes, or their plans for a potential franchise revival. With Jordan out of the picture, Warner Bros. Were forced to supplement the loss of what they had admitted was the movie's biggest draw. While getting another athlete of Jordan's notoriety and generally clean reputation would be impossible, the Looney Tunes thankfully lended themselves well to different mediums. In 2001, Variety reported that action film star Jackie Chan, who had recently inspired the Jackie Chan Adventures cartoon on Kids WB, was tapped to star in a spy thriller-inspired sequel called Spy Jam. Chan himself commented, stating,
"My managers are negotiating. I like cartoons. It would be very, very fun."
To date, these are the only official words spoken on the film's existence. Additionally, a NASCAR-inspired spin-off was also reported to be in the works, titled Race Jam. Yeah, Race Jam. While a lot of retrospective reporting stated this would feature Jeff Gordon, and it does make sense given his unparalleled fame in racing at the time, as well as Gordon's own cameo in Looney Tunes Back in Action, it's worth noting for the sake of accuracy that Gordon was never officially attached to the project or even reported to be pursued. After their existence was confirmed, these two Space Jam sequels would slowly fade away, with no further word or even an official cancellation notice being given from Chan or Warner Bros. It's not known how much work was done on either of these ill-fated sequels, but there's a chance enough was left to inspire the next film on this list. Speaking of which, with the death of not one, but 3 potential Space Jam sequels and no clear path forward, Warner Bros. Decided to shift their focus to a more Looney Tunes-centric project, with the hope of a large-scale franchise revival to follow. There were a few ideas thrown around for this, including a Duck Dodgers feature-length film, whose test footage was actually used for the resulting television show's intro. Eventually, the more ensemble-focused Back in Action was decided on, probably because of what they already had finished from their last attempt at a theatrical Tunes film. While it's not confirmed, and hasn't really been asked about, it's likely that Jackie Chan's Spy Jam was far enough into the scripting stage to be used as the blueprint for Back in Action. The latter film ended up with a whopping 25 writers credited by the time of its completion, despite only being announced with 3. And this massive final tally could be owed to the number of rewrites that saw the film shift from the Jackie Chan crossover to the still spy-inspired Back in Action, because it shares its DNA with the failed Spy Jam. That does technically make this a Space Jam sequel. There's also the fact that Space Jam itself had a heavy influence on how this film was handled. I know this video is for the sequels, but it does bear mentioning that the first Space Jam wasn't without issue at the time of its release. Many hardcore Looney Tunes fans disliked the film right off the bat for its reported treatment of veteran voice actors from the series, whose voice roles were notably recast for the film. Criticism was also aimed at the characters' personalities, which were tweaked to fit into the premise and plot of a family blockbuster. Veteran animator Chuck Jones was famously escorted out of a screening of the film after causing a disruption over how much he hated it. In a case of maybe taking things just a little too seriously, Jones would go on to state that his biggest problem with the film was that Bugs Bunny would never ask for help to beat the Monstars, or even need the film's 90 minutes, believing he could do it alone in a 7-minute short. When developing Back in Action, Warner Bros. Approached director Joe Dante, who had previously worked on Gremlins, Small Soldiers, and a rejected Goodfellas-esque film about Jones called Termite Terrace. Dante had a deep respect for Jones, and a deep desire to see his friend's characters done justice. Because of this, he signed on for the film, but only on the condition that he had final say over the personalities of the animated characters. This new Looney Tunes film was meant to spearhead WB's planned revival for the franchise, and was supported with merchandise, video games, and a new series of theatrical shorts that would premiere before upcoming Warner films for the next few years. These would be overseen by Larry Doyle, one of the film's main screenwriters, who shared Dante's reverence for the more provocative shorts of the 1960s. However, the film's development and release didn't end up inspiring much confidence. Production on the film was a nightmare for Dante and his crew. The cycle itself was incredibly short, with the film being officially announced in July of 2002 for a release date just 1 year later, before eventually being delayed until November of 2003. Warner Bros. Producers also micromanaged the content of the film to death, wanting it to be as broadly appealing as possible. This included gags that seemed relevant to the times, no matter how out of place they would seem. While Joe Dante doesn't talk about the film much in interviews, when he does, it usually focuses on the executive meddling he had to deal with. In an interview with Suicide Girls in 2007, just 4 years after Back in Action released, he would state,
"I was making a movie for Warner Bros. With those characters, and they didn't want to know about those characters. They didn't want to know why Bugs Bunny shouldn't do hip-hop. It was a pretty grim experience all around."
Thankfully, Dante had the power to stop anything like that last bit from happening. This new guy? Yeah. In 2016, the veteran director would elaborate on this a bit further in a brief mention of the film.
"I took that on because my friend Chuck Jones had recently passed away, and I felt I owed it to him to present the characters as accurately as possible, which hadn't been the case with Space Jam. It was very frustrating to make. We got so much input from people who were never going to see the movie. When I saw its final cut, I thought it was a noisy, annoying movie of the sort that other people would make. I do feel it does represent the characters accurately. I came out feeling exhausted, but that's the norm these days."
When it was released in November of 2003, things didn't go much better. Back in Action received better reviews than Space Jam, with praise aimed mostly at the characterizations of the tunes, but it bombed financially, grossing just $68 million against an $80 million budget. In addition to the middling quality, the film fell victim to a crowded release schedule that included Brother Bear and Elf, films that both earned almost 400% more in box office gross than Back in Action. This resulted in the derailing of numerous careers, including Dante as a director, Brendan Fraser as an A-list star, and Warner Bros. Feature Animation itself, which would close down after the financial failure of Back in Action and pretty much everything it ever made besides Space Jam. Even the film's tie-in game would have ports canceled for Xbox and Windows because of the film's poor draw. The disappointment of Back in Action also killed any hope for the planned Looney Tunes revival, with Doyle's theatrical shorts being shelved completely. They would eventually see the light of day through the film's Blu-ray release and were received very poorly, with some rumors out there actually stating he was taken off the job by Warner after poor internal reception of his work. Much more important than the shorts, though, the failure of Looney Tunes Back in Action meant the death of one last, and only recently discovered, planned spin-off. While it's true that no athlete on Earth could ever reach the fame and glory of Michael Jordan in 1996, things were changing by the 2000s. The rise of extreme sports had led to new stars and a new cultural mainstream, with no one from this era being more popular, more universally loved, and less recognizable in an everyday situation than skateboarder Tony Hawk. By 2003, Hawk was known as an X Games champ, a pioneer of skating, and was the most successful face of a sports gaming franchise since John Madden. We didn't know it at the time, but Hawk himself revealed in 2019 that his fame had earned him a call from Warner Bros., who had previously collaborated with the star for the 2001 Ada Tour. With the planned franchise reboot of Looney Tunes and predicted smash success of Back in Action, WB went to the Birdman himself to see if he'd be interested in the idea of a crossover sequel, one that would bring the less than ever enduring Looney Tunes together with the thing marketing executives decided kids at the time respected the most. Can we not sit here and pretend that there was any more thought put into it than that? I mean, come on. The film was tentatively titled Skate Jam, and WB asked Hawk if he'd be ready to start filming just as soon as Back in Action released. And then, Back in Action released. After that, with the pause button hit on the Looney Tunes revival and the kill switch flipped on Warner Bros. Animation, Skate Jam had wiped out before it even got on the board. After the failure of Back in Action, the years would go by, with multiple small-scale attempts at the Looney Tunes revival and rumors of a sequel to the original Space Jam never quite fading away. LeBron James' name was connected to the title for years before officially being announced in 2014, and even then, fans had to wait nearly a decade to see it released. Given the time it took to get everything finished, and the way things look like they're going to turn out, there's a good chance that in time, stories from Space Jam 2's development will come out that show a process just as hectic and focus-tested as its predecessor and everything that came between them. While people may enjoy Space Jam 2 once it's released, and it's very likely it will be a financial success, I think it's a safe bet that it won't do anything to help the Looney Tunes franchise. What we've seen makes it feel like everything else on this list, an attempt to pull life out of a dated property with producers so focused on trend chasing and reference making that they fail to let these characters embody any of the traits that help make them so memorable in the first place. While it took a few years, people did eventually realize that Space Jam, a film based on a commercial for shoes, lacked the heart and soul that made Looney Tunes so great for so long. 25 years later, we'll see if a film based on a commercial for shoes has anything more to offer. For now, though, these have been the failed Space Jam sequels, in all the ways they were roughed up.